What's different between men and women? All right. Well, there's a variety of things. You know, the classic human embryological form is female, XX or XY. And the males are masculinized in utero by testosterone. So that's the first difference. And testosterone exposure in utero has quite profound effects on all sorts of later phenomena, psychological and physical. So for example, one of the things that higher levels of testosterone in utero seem to predict is less interest in people and more interest in things. And that's been well documented by research teams in the UK in particular. But in any case, so the standard morphology is female, but it's translated into male morphology by testosterone. And so then what do you get for standard morphological transformations? Well, there's the evident genetic ones, speaking technically. Obviously, male and female genitalia differ substantially, as you all no doubt know. There is some variation in that, although it's very rare. And then there are also other differences that kick forward, especially when puberty hits. And some of those are physiological and some of them are psychological. So one of the things that you see happening, for example, is that there aren't very large personality differences between boys and girls before puberty with regards to negative emotion. So that's trait neuroticism for those of you who are interested in Big Five trait terminology. And so people who are higher in neuroticism are more sensitive to anxiety and emotional pain. And women are more sensitive than men to anxiety and emotional pain on average. And the effect isn't massive, it's about a third to half a standard deviation. But it's massive enough so that if you look at the end of the distributions, where the extreme people are, almost all the people who have extreme problems with anxiety and emotional pain are women. It's running about 4-to-1 in terms of depression and anxiety disorder diagnosis worldwide. And there's no evidence that that's cultural. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, so to speak, there are male pathologies as well. So males are much more likely to manifest antisocial personality disorder. They're much more likely to be characterized by alcoholism. And they're also much more likely to manifest attention deficit disorder and various learning disabilities. And so that also seems to be biologically predicated to a large degree. So, and interestingly enough, those differences, the personality differences between men and women with regards to trait negative emotion emerge at puberty. Well, why? Well, let's think about it for a minute. Now, these are speculations, but you can think about them and tell me what you think. I mean, they're reasonably grounded speculations, but I'm not certainly going to state them as fact, although I would say that the idea that these differences in personality between men and women exist, that's fact. How powerful how large those differences are, and precisely what they consist of, is still subject to some investigation, but it's extraordinarily well documented. So, what happens to men and women at puberty? Well, the men get bigger, and they get stronger, especially in their upper bodies. And human beings are quite aggressive. We're prey animals we're predators as well as prey animals. And one of the ways that we defend ourselves aggressively is using upper body strength. So we punch, like kangaroos. There's other animals that do that. And we punch. And so what that means is that men are quite a bit more dangerous than women in, say, hand-to-hand combat. And that's actually a real problem. You see that manifest itself in part in a strange statistic, because it will come as news to most of you, but wives hit their husbands more often than husbands hit their wives. Quite a lot, actually. But it's a misleading statistic to some degree, because women lack upper body strength. They can hit their husbands and they're not really going to hurt them that much. I mean, there are men who are abused, and I'm not trying to make light of that. But one of the problems with having much higher upper body strength is that if you hit someone, you're liable to hurt them. And so male aggression in the context of a dyadic relationship, physical aggression, is much more likely to be dangerous or lethal than female aggression of the same sort. And it's part of the reason I think that women are more likely to hit their husbands, or wives are more likely to hit their husbands than the reverse, is because both the wives and the husbands know perfectly well that the wife isn't going to hurt the husband that much, so there isn't as much inhibition against the aggression. Okay, so now what does it mean for women that men are stronger than them starting at puberty? It means that women are at a disadvantage in physical combat, and that's part of the reason I think that their nervous systems make them more nervous, more anxious, and more susceptible to emotional pain, is because the world's actually more dangerous for them. Now, the world's also more dangerous for women sexually. Now, that's self-evident. really think I have to explain that. I hope no one is foolish enough to try to disagree with that. The reason that sex is more dangerous for women than it is for men, obviously, is because women can get pregnant. And that changes their life completely. I mean, they may choose to have an abortion, but that in itself is no trivial matter. And as soon as you have a child, and that child is dependent on you, then your whole life has changed. And in more traditional societies, if you had a sexual adventure outside of the standard traditional structures, and you ended up pregnant, then you are in serious trouble. And so for women to be more anxious and more susceptible to emotional pain because of their increased sexual vulnerability is perfectly reasonable. Then the final reason I think that women are more susceptible to anxiety and emotional pain than men is because, let me see now, I may have lost my train of thought for that. I'll have to come back to that for a moment. Oh yes, that's it. That's it. You know, it's not obvious to me that women's nervous systems are actually served to function in the best interests of women. I think that they actually serve to function in the best interests of women and infants. Because if you think about our evolutionary past, and for that matter, our present, you know, you're quite a different creature when you're a single person, male or female, than you are when you're a female that has an infant, especially an infant that's under about 9 months old. Because human infants are unbelievably fragile. You know, they're born, in some sense, way before they should be, and that's part of an evolutionary problem too, because our heads are so big that our babies have to be born very young compared to other mammals of our size, roughly speaking. The gestation period should be longer for human beings, and because our heads are so big, the babies have to come out early, and that makes them relatively underdeveloped. And so they need a tremendous amount of care, and they're very fragile. And so it seems to be quite likely that women's nervous systems are optimized so that they're more threat sensitive and more sensitive to emotional pain because they have to be more responsive to infants and they have to take care of them, especially in their most fragile state, and that would be in the first 9 months. And I think that tilts women's nervous systems hard in the direction of what men might regard as excessive negative emotionality. But you have to be sensitive to threat and danger if you're going to have an infant because they're very, very fragile. So I think those are the reasons. And there's lots of other personality differences between men and women. You know, I can give you a list of them, and these are well documented, and so you might as well know about them. There's not a lot of difference in men and women in terms of extroversion. If you look at extroversion as a whole, extroversion is roughly the dimension the dimension of personality that's associated with positive emotion. And extroverted people are gregarious and enthusiastic and assertive. They like to party. They like to have a good time. The social environment is their environment. And extroversion breaks down into enthusiasm and assertiveness. And women are more enthusiastic, which means that not only do they have more negative emotion than men, they also have more positive emotion. And so that's the positive emotion dimension. The negative emotion dimension is neuroticism, as I said, somewhat unpleasantly named, I would guess, but it basically indexes anxiety and emotional pain, frustration, disappointment, grief, that sort of thing, all load on the same dimension. That breaks into volatility, and volatile people are rather irritable and withdrawal, and people who withdraw are less likely to do things that are threatening. And women are higher by about 1/3 of a standard deviation in both of those. Agreeableness is the dimension that men and women differ on the most. And agreeable people, and this is, I think, the most fundamental dimension of maternality that characterizes human beings. So agreeable people are compassionate and polite and warm and kind and giving. But it's easy to take advantage of them, and they're not that good at standing up for themselves. And actually, if you look at one of the things that predicts wage differential across time, male or female, is more agreeable people get paid less. And the reason for that is that often salary negotiations are zero sum. And if you're not aggressive, you don't get paid, because people aren't just going to give you money because they're going to be nice to you. That is not how it works. You generally have to fight for status and position and movement forward in careers. And in order to do that, you have to take a relatively, I would say, self-centered attitude, because the opposite, in some sense, the opposite of being agreeable is to be self-centered. And I'm also not saying that in a particularly negative way. There's advantages to being self-centered and to fight for your own territory, and men are more likely to do that. And you might say, well, what's your evidence that those differences in personality aren't culturally constructed? And the evidence for that is quite clear. You can go online, you can look up the Scandinavian studies. Just go online and look up gender differences in personality cross-culturally. You'll find the relevant studies. They've been done with tens of thousands of people, and what they've shown quite clearly is that in those societies where the most has been done to move the social world into a position of radical equality, and so that would roughly be the Scandinavian countries, because they've done more of that than any other country, the personality differences between men and women maximize. They don't minimize. They maximize. And I'll say that again. In the countries where the most has been done to equalize the playing field between men and women get more different rather than more the same. So for all you social constructionists out there in the audience, and there's probably not that many of you because you wouldn't come and hear me talk if you were a social constructionist, you're actually wrong. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the thing is, you know, that so one of the things you might be interested in is that it's all the same to me in some sense. Like when I was looking into this to begin with, and this would have started probably 25 years ago, looking at differences in personality between men and women, you know, it wasn't obvious at all whether they were fundamentally biological or fundamentally sociological, or what mix produced the differences. You know, no one knew. And the most logical hypothesis, really, I thought, was that as you equalize the society, that men and women would become more the same. But that is not what happened. And so we've actually put the social constructionist hypothesis with regards to gender differences in sex and personality. We put that to the test in a very intense way, and the social constructionist viewpoint failed. So it's very strange, because no one would have really believed that, right? You make society more the same, and men and women get more different. It's like, what's up with that? Well, the answer seems to be is that there's fundamentally two sources of variability in personality, right? There's perhaps more, but you can categorize them as roughly genetic and roughly sociological. Well, if you take out all the sociological differences between the landscape in which men and women are raised, all you have left are the biological and genetic differences. So they maximize. Well, that's exactly what happened. This actually matters. It really matters. And this is why the demands for equity are so, well, there's about 15 reasons why demands for equity border on differences between men and women should not be overlooked. Partly because it's wrong to overlook the genuine differences between men and women. It's not good for the men, it's not good for the women. So one of the things you see in Scandinavia, for example, is there's an overwhelming preponderance of female nurses. And there's an overwhelming preponderance of male engineers. And actually, the data on personality differences, there's the standard traits, which I'll continue to go through. I can do that quite quickly. There's not much difference in trait conscientiousness between men and women. If you break it down into the aspects, women are a bit more orderly than men, but there's no difference in industriousness. And then with regards to openness, which is the intellect creativity dimension, overall there's no difference between men and women, but if you break it up into the aspects, then the differences are actually quite pronounced. So what you have is that openness to experience is the technical trait, and it roughly breaks down into something that's sort of like creativity and aesthetic interests versus interest in ideas. And what you see is that women are a third of the standard deviation higher than men in terms of creativity and aesthetic proclivity, let's say, and men are 1/3 of a standard deviation higher than women in terms of interest in ideas. And it's not a trivial difference, and it makes a difference. So, but the biggest difference between men and women, as it turns out, and this is almost 1 standard deviation, which is a walloping difference. You never see that in social science. It's a massive difference. Is difference in interest. And the masculine interest, roughly speaking, is in things, and the female interest, roughly speaking, is in people. And that's what underlies the differences, say, in career choice preference between things like nursing and psychology and social work and that sort of thing, and engineering. And because engineering is perhaps the most male-oriented of all the disciplines, and the evidence that that's sociological is very, very weak. Now, I should also point out, because this is important, people have wondered for a long time if the differences between men and women, say with regards to the sciences and the engineering, had anything to do with intelligence. And the former president of Harvard, Larry Summers, got in terrible trouble at one point. In fact, I think he had to resign, because he made a very technical claim. He said that If you look at the distributions of intelligence for men and women, imagine you have a normal distribution, right? So almost everybody's at the average. There's some extremely intelligent people, but not very many. And there's some people who are very intellectually impaired, but not very many. If you map the distributions of men and women onto one another, there's two hypotheses. One hypothesis, roughly speaking, is that they're the same. And the evidence for that is reasonable, I would say. The other theory is that the means are the same. The mean is the same. So both men and women have an average IQ of 100. But the standard deviation is different. So it's larger in men than it is in women. And what that means is that if you go way the hell out into the hypergenius range, they're almost all men. But also if you go way the hell out into the range where people are incredibly intellectually impaired, they're also all men. And that's the increased male variability hypothesis. And you see increased male variability in a number of different species, partly because men are more expendable than women. And the reason for that, biologically speaking, the reason for that is that, well, you don't need that many men to impregnate a lot of women, but you need women. Women are a bottleneck with regards to reproduction, and so every woman counts, although not every man counts. And that's true in many, many species. And so you see more variability in male behavior because of that across species frequently. And that comes often at a cost of increased male illness. And look at it, guys. You're going to die about 8 years sooner than the typical woman. And that's partly the price you pay for running partly on testosterone, because it's quite toxic over the long run. So men do pay for their whatever advantages they might have. And they pay for that with a lifespan that's decreased by about 10%. It's a non-trivial disadvantage. But anyways, what Larry Summers said was, well, if the IQ distribution is flatter for men than for women, maybe one of the reasons that almost all the outstanding men in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics are male is because it takes a genius level, an IQ level of, say, 150 or 160. And when you get way out on the distributions, when the distributions differ like that, then there's massive differences at the ends. Now, he didn't say that was true, by the way. He said that that was one possibility. And by the way, it is one possibility because nature doesn't arrange itself so that everything it presents to us is in keeping with what we would like to be true politically. In fact, quite the contrary. Now, I'm kind of agnostic with regards to that because I've looked at the data on both sides. And I don't think that we can make a determinative statement about the differences in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, overrepresentation of men on the basis of variability and intelligence. But I do think we can make the case in terms of interest, because it is the case that the biggest differences that there are between men and women are differences in interest. And the question is, well, do we have a problem with that? Is that really a problem? Now, you could set up your culture to eradicate those differences. Because you can make cultures very coercive. And so if you punished boys from the time they were born for being interested in things and insisted that they become more interested in people, then perhaps you could do that. It would come at some cost, and you could do the same thing to girls. You could make them less interested in people and more interested in things. But, to the degree that those differences are real, and to the degree that they're actually bounded or grounded in biology, you're going to have to turn your society into something pretty damn tyrannical to produce those differences. So do you want to do that? And if you do, well, why do you want to do it? Is it a big problem that men and women actually have different interests? And is it really that big a surprise? And is that something we want to eradicate?